I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Politics and baseball. Let me see. Baseball, politics. I'm going to go with baseball because I have with me right now my two colleagues, Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, great voice of the Great Lakes, and Francis Rose of Federal News Radio. Each day with In Depth with Francis Rose in your drive home in Washington. And it just so happens what these two gentlemen have in common is that they're lording over the struggling New York Yankees, which is the hometown team where I am, because the Nationals are in first place, I believe, comfortably, and the Detroit Tigers are in first place, I believe, comfortably, although nothing's ever comfortable enough for the Bengals. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. First to Mr. McCotter in Detroit. I understand you have some inclement weather, but the Tigers are doing very well. You don't mention them to me. Is that part of your superstition that Tiger fans don't cheer out loud to Yankee fans? Good evening to you, Thaddeus.
No, we don't have superstitions. We just have a track record of beating the Yankees in the postseason that we enjoy. We don't hold it over you, John.
No.
The problem that the Tigers have right now is their bullpen's a little shaky of late. The hitting's kind of tailed off, no pun intended, and so we're only a half game ahead of the surging Royals, and the way things are going in Pittsburgh tonight, we may be out of first place by the end of the evening.
Now, you see how you actually worry with a first-place team. I know it's new to you, Francis. The Nationals, are they a dominant story in Washington? When you sit down to talk politics or worry about the president, is it the Nationals that come up first? Good evening to you, Francis.
Good evening, John and Thaddeus. The Nationals come up quite often, and believe it or not, because we've only had baseball here at the major league level since 2005, we actually have a twofer, a doubleheader. We can talk about the Orioles in first place in the American League East, too. Washington claimed them as the local team for, I believe, 33 years between when the Senators left in 1971 and the Nats came back in 2005.
I had no idea you were doing that. So you're still rooting for the Birds, and then at the same time you vote, what do you call them, the Nats? Is that what you call them?
That's right, and we do not put a G at the beginning of that, John. That's very pejorative. Please don't do that.
What did I do? Did I put a G? Thaddeus, did I put a G in front of Nats? I don't remember doing that.
No, I don't remember seeing you do that, but we're on radio.
All right, so the Orioles, the Birds, and the Tigers, the Bengals, and the Nats, not with a G, the Nats. So now that we've established the important thing, which is baseball, let's move on to the next important thing in Washington, which is a campaign for what? Legalizing marijuana? Is that what's happening, Francis?
Well, that seems to be what the representative from Washington, D.C., Eleanor Holmes Norton, is making a campaign around. She has the benefit, though, of being a Democrat in a town where I believe the latest registration number was 90% Democrat. So she can pretty much run on anything and count on being elected. The primary is pretty much over, and she just has to show up on Election Day.
The D.C. Board of Elections voted unanimously Wednesday to put legalization on the November ballot. Thaddeus, how's marijuana legalization doing in Detroit and Wayne County?
Well, we're having difficulty with the implementation. The legal implementation, I mean, I suppose it's been around. I know some people with some hydroponic lights and stuff.
No, I'm talking about formal legal recognition. All right, fine.
I'm sure it's very popular with the libertarians.
Now we come to the low standing of politics in America. Congress is out of town, so we're momentarily safe. And I start with Thaddeus McCotter, a recovering politician. Thaddeus, what's this election about? Have you heard a theme identified by the Republicans or the Democrats as we have weeks left to the midterm election?
No, they're just not the other side, and that seems to be where we're headed. And as Francis and I have talked about, it seems to be going from what should be a Republican year. I still think they'll win some seats because of the nature of what seats are open and the competitive nature in the House. But in the end of the day, this has gone from a Republican election to an anti-incumbent election, I think, and it's going to mute some of the gains Republicans should make.
Francis, Congress out of town means that things are necessarily quiet in the center of town, but the politics are difficult to discern from here. Is there an expectation when the Congress comes back in September that there will be a theme, something like Contract with America or an anti-war theme that the Democrats used successfully in past midterms?
Right now, John, there's no indication that anybody has any theme except gritting their teeth and crossing their fingers. That may be good or it may be bad. There are some folks, actually, that I've found that think that that's not necessarily bad. But the idea of a particular theme is hard to see coming out because there's not really a theme among the electorate. Story in Politico that jumped out at me over the weekend, they talked to a bunch of pollsters who seem to think that the electorate, as Thaddeus indicated, doesn't like anybody right now. They don't like Democrats. They don't like Republicans. They don't like the issues that either party's focusing on. And the electorate is generally pretty grumpy. What that may mean is that independents who aren't particularly motivated to vote for one person or vote against one person may not bother to show up. It turns out to be a pretty heavily oriented election toward whoever the base voters are in any particular location, and you'll wind up with a whole bunch of the same thing you got now.
Thaddeus, we've done our very careful reporting of, let me name a few domestic issues that have dominated the news these last years. That would be the Affordable Care Act, and then there was the Veterans Affairs scandal of mistreatment and abuse and denial and deception, and we could throw in the IRS matter of the alleged investigation of conservative groups by one or more individuals at the IRS. That's a short list of domestic matters. Have they disappeared? Is that the nature of the American public? They can't stay with anything for more than 6 weeks.
No, I think they're measuring the totality of the problems that the country faces, the paucity of the political class's response, and they find them wanting. The American public puts up with the political class when it operates functionally. And it's not operating in a functional manner, as we've talked about before. It's dysfunctional and ergo divorced from the affections of the American people.
I observed, Mr. McCotter, and I saw this when you were in Congress, and now that you're recovered, I can share it with you. The worst you can do in Washington is number 2, and that's not so bad when you have all that money to divide up. And so right now, are both sides running for number 2, shrugging it off? What can they do to us?
Well, I think the American public considers both sides number 2 at the present time.
Francis, you laugh, but it's your job to carry the baggage here. So have we an election where no one cares what the results are because we're all going to, I can't say, we'll all win together. That's my most positive presentation to you.
That's a very positive presentation. I'm just laughing because Thaddeus stole my joke. The sense that people seem to be getting in Washington about this election, John, is that first of all, with Lamar Alexander completing the running of the table by all of the incumbent Republicans that were primaried by Tea Party people, the sense is that the Tea Party revolution has not run its course yet, but isn't the threat that people expected it to be for many years, and that this is going to turn out to be same old in November election-wise. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to get all the same people back, and I think Thaddeus's point that this could be potentially an anti-incumbent election is valid on some degree. He and I debated that a little bit the other night on your program, but the bottom line that people here in Washington seem to be thinking when it comes to the election is, first of all, it's too early to tell if anything odd is going to happen, and second of all, it's hard to foresee what odd could happen at this point.
Immigration. I mentioned another issue that seems to have gotten a lot of headlines recently, but it's disappeared now under the pall of warfare in the Middle East and the threat in Ukraine, and I mentioned Ebola in West Africa. Is immigration a story that moves, about 16% of the cable audience, or is it a national issue, Thaddeus, in your measure from Detroit?
I think it's clearly a national issue, both in terms of border security, in terms of our economy, and in terms of the Republican Party standing with Hispanic voters. This is critical, not only to the elections this November, but the November elections in 2016. And I think that the public, one of the reasons that they're disgusted with the political class is that this problem has been allowed to continue. It has been allowed to grow larger, and now we're at a critical point down south in Texas and elsewhere with children being abused and used and forced by the cartels to some degree to come into the country. And now what do we do? So I think that that the issue is a large issue, and it will, in many ways, the way it is resolved will determine what type of nation we're going to be, I would think, for the remainder of the next 20 to 30, 40 years.
Francis, I generalize, but the election in 2008 was against the Republicans who'd wrecked the country. The election in 2010 was against the Democrats who'd wrecked the country. The election in 2012 was against Mitt Romney, who was going to wreck the country. That's what we lack this year, Francis. We lack a villain who is going to wreck things, or we lack a cause to stop people from wrecking. That's why we feel this I don't want to use a French word. What is it? Translate ennui. We feel this despair. We feel despair because nobody's going to wreck anything and we don't care.
Well, I would argue to that point, then, that to the degree that I agree with Thaddeus, he's on to the fact that people believe this year, or seem to, that everybody's wrecked the country, that neither Democrats nor Republicans are immune from the wrecking and would like to hold them responsible for it. The polls certainly seem to indicate that. Republicans are no more popular than Democrats, and neither party is any more popular than, say, used car salesmen or ticks.
Which is why they don't give us an option on the ballot. None of the above. Get rid of them all. Francis Rose of Federal News Radio and the Nats, without a G. I've learned this from you, Francis. I'm going to wear you down on it. And also the Orioles. He covers both leagues. And Thaddeus McCotter, who is only with the Detroit Tigers, unless, of course, he's with that crowd at ice time called the Red Wings. I'm John Batchelor.